Hey, it's Drybear. In the Season of Blood, there will be brand new uniques and legendaries coming into the game. So I thought it'd be a good idea today to go through all of those new items, partially so we understand what's coming into the game, so you can make new builds and maybe even spark your innovation and your inspiration to playing new playstyles in Season 2, but also so that you can potentially find the last Lego block that you were looking for on past builds. I've seen a lot of people do this with the announcement of Season 2. They were trying to make a companion build for Druid. They were trying to make some specific build work, and it was missing a little oomph or a little power, and these new powers and uniques coming in might be the final piece of the puzzle that allows you to finish that build you've always wanted to do. So today we're going to go through all of the new uniques and legendary powers coming into Season 2 in just a couple days. Now, if you have any questions or comments for me, you can find me live on Twitch, twitch.tv/Drybear. Be free to come by and ask there. But let's jump into these. Keep in mind that every single one of these new uniques can only drop in World Tier 4. They didn't give us an exact level. Some of these don't drop. I mean, some of the previous ones wouldn't drop until you were level 70 or 75. But I think all of these new ones fit into the higher echelon of requirement before they start dropping. So keep that in mind. And also keep in mind, we have endgame bosses now that drop uniques that you can get and farm on a regular basis. So these should be a little bit easier to get into. So let's jump into this list, starting with the unique items. The first one is the Tassets of the Dawning Sky. I love the fact that they're adding a unique leg item because I feel like there just aren't that many that are good. They didn't give us stats for these, and this will be crucial in these being actually very effective as uniques. For anyone who hasn't played a lot of Diablo 4, one of the downsides for running a unique item is you can't choose and re-roll the stats on it, which means sometimes you get unique items that have not good stats, let's say. So for example, in the past, we've had unique boots that didn't have movement speed on them, unique weapons that didn't have offensive stats on them. And since we're locked into those categories, into those specific slots, losing out on those stats is a very big negative draw. So I like the fact they're adding unique pants. I hope this has good stats on it, but this one goes along with the resistance changes that they're making in Season 2. When you take damage from a non-physical, a magical source of any kind, you gain 6 to 10% maximum resistance to that damage type for 6 seconds. It can only apply to one damage type at a time, and they don't mention this. It doesn't seem like it has an internal cooldown, which means it could just be swapping to a new element all the time. So if you find a nightmare dungeon that has one specific type of elemental damage, or you're going against a world boss, I think these could actually be really, really good. And keep in mind, they reworked resistances to no longer have a built-in diminishing return, which means that if you have 70% maximum cold resistance, getting 10% more cold resistance is really actually just 10% more damage reduction to that type. It's not greatly diminished and super nerfed and scaled down so that when you get 10% more, it's actually 0.4% more. It's actually the amount you're getting here, and you're increasing the maximum, which is super valuable. So this could be a really, really nice item, especially for target farming specific dungeons or specific bosses. Like the Beast in the Ice might be primarily cold damage, and so you can run these Tassets against heavily elemental fights to specifically tailor your defense to that encounter, which I think is really cool. Tusk Helm of Jorit the Mighty. This is a Barbarian unique helm. When you gain Berserking while already Berserk, so if you're already Berserk and you gain a new Berserk, this is super easy to do. There's tons of Berserking sources. There's some that you can activate manually, some that activate on proc chance. You have a 40 to 60% chance to become more enraged, granting 15% multiplicative increased damage, 2 fury generated per second, and 10% cooldown reduction. So you're going to get 15% multiplied damage when you berserk while you berserk, which means berserking builds get a little bit more interesting, and it does make you want to build more into berserk, right? You may not only want just like Wrath of the Berserker or proc chances, you may want to build all of them, because then if you're running this unique helm, you can get a lot of value out of it. And I think helm is a great spot to put this in. Typically helms are used for defense. You run like Aspect of Might or Protector on it, but having this as an option for cooldown reduction plus stats, once we see the stats on this, this could actually be pretty interesting. I'm curious about the 2 fury per second. This might be along with some changes that we are predicting they might do to shouts, because I feel like in general, if you run the 3 shout meta for Barbarian, you don't really have to worry about fury, but having 2 fury per second on this unique is actually pretty cool. Dolmen Stone is a unique Druid amulet that's getting a lot of really good positive feedback from people in the Diablo 4 community. What this does is when you cast Boulder and you have Hurricane up, the Hurricane will pick up the boulder and have it roll around you, hitting all the targets in an area. And it can pick up multiple boulders as well if you have cooldown resets or, free boulders that proc from Nature's Wrath or things like that. You'd have multiple boulders going around. But this one has so much awesome potential for Druid in general. There's not really that many boulder builds because it's hard to get the boulder to hit the target that you want multiple times. And any enemy that is CC immune, like bosses, the boulder sucks against, because the boulder relies on being able to hit the target and push them along with the boulder to deal damage. And it has effects that trigger after multiple hits and multiple sources of damage. However, when you roll a boulder against a boss and there's no wall behind them, it's just going to hit a couple times and keep going because they're CC immune. So the Dolmen Stone actually helps alleviate some of this problem with the boulder build, because you can keep the boulder around you hitting multiple times over and over and over. Now, hopefully this still works with the overpower procs and the stun procs and all those things that go along with boulder, but I think this one is probably one of the more fun ones that they're introducing in Season 2. Scoundrel's Leathers is a rogue unique chest item. Chest slot is primarily a defensive slot, so we hope to see some really good defensive stats on this chest piece when they release the stats for it. While you have unlimited energy from Inner Sight, your Inner Sight proc for rogue, your core skills have a 60 to 80% chance to spawn a trap, which means Caltrop, Poison Trap, or Death Trap. It can be Death Trap or Poison Trap. And Caltrops doesn't do crazy damage, but it does have some nice applications that can go along with this. And it's great about this is you can actually do full Death Trap builds with this, and Inner Sight can then have your core skills proc more Death Traps, and Death Traps can cause more procs to go off as well. This one, it would be a very, very strong build for Season 2. This might actually be one of the top 3 builds, a full trap build for Rogue in Season 2, just because having this go off from core skills specifically with a very high proc chance makes this super awesome. And I do hope this has good stats on it, because Rogues are going to be eating good from that as well. Next is the Blood Moon Breaches Necromancer unique pants. Your minions have a 3 to 7% chance to curse enemies. Enemies affected by at least one of your curses take 70% multiplicable increased overpower damage from you. Now, the questions I have about this set item, this piece item here in general, is what does it mean by curse enemies? Does it randomly choose between Iron Maiden and your Decrepify? Does it only choose one that you have selected available? What if you have none selected available? How does it choose? And from that, we can actually kind of pull a lot out of this. Now, it could just be both. And if you put points into Iron Maiden, maybe you get free essence coming out from this when you cast it. Maybe you can actually get some really nice Decrepify casts from this. And then in itself, since we're losing the malignant stone, the malignant heart that gives us the ability to free cast curses without having to actually cast it ourselves, this might be a nice replacement where your minions can do it. And it gives you increased multiplicative overpower damage, which means that the Blood Nova or the Blood Speaker build for Blood Overpower Minion build for Necro is looking really, really strong with the addition of these pants. Blue Rose is a Sorcerer unique ring. This one is on lucky hit. Damaging an enemy has up to 30% chance of forming an exploding ice spike, dealing a flat value, 0.25 to 0.35 base scalar cold damage, and you triple this chance if the enemy is frozen. This is going to be really fun for like Frozen Orb or Ice Shard builds, because you do actually get there's a bunch of passive effects in the Sorcerer build tree that does proc ice spikes through your ultimate, deep freezes, your Frost Nova, things like that. You get tons of ways to proc these, which is super nice. Having a lucky hit chance on Ring that gives you a chance of forming an exploding ice spike, which deals damage, and this damage is tripled, we might actually just get enough to do crazy ice spike builds that focus on those proc chances and high freezing, high chilling, which we haven't really been able to do. It's usually just been ice shards as the primary frost build, and it's been hard to do Frozen Orb. But maybe with these, we might actually get some more ice builds available, moving Blue Rose into that. And again, I really hope this has awesome, awesome unique stats on it once we finally get our hands on it. The Godslayer Crown is a generic unique helm, so any class can use this. When you stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite enemy, so any of the hard CCs outside of fear, so if you stun, freeze, or immobilize an enemy, or damage a boss for any reason, it pulls in nearby enemies. You deal 30 to 60% increased damage. This X suggests it's multiplicative. Increased damage then for 3 seconds. This effect can only occur once every 12 seconds. So stun, freeze, or immobilize is available to every class in the game. Those are very easily accessible CC effects. And some classes have plenty of really good burst. It's just not very large AoE. And so having a item that allows you to vortex enemies into a spot might make it very viable for some builds to work. Like specifically even Barbarian, if you think about the earthquakes that exist in Diablo 3 that are, you know, the size of a fighting area, and then the little baby earthquakes that we have in Diablo 4 that aren't that big, this might be able to make things like that work a lot better because you can actually wait for that vortex to come in, place it on top, and dump all of your AoE in one spot, and everything starts to work much, much better. This also will probably work, by the way. My first thought on this was using a companion build for Druid using the crows. The crows got insanely buffed in season 2, and that active where you put it down and it pulses in a small area does crazy damage now. So it's very possible that you could run this with the companion build on Druid and do really, really well with it. Flicker Step is a unique boot that has been added, and actually is bringing a lot of really interesting opportunities to Diablo 4, because primarily some classes are very ultimate ability reliant. They have to use their ultimate properly in order to get good value out of their build. But some classes have the ability to reset their ultimate really, really quickly, like Necromancer or Rogue, and some classes don't. They have to wait the full minute or more in order to get their ultimate back off cooldown. So Flicker Step being a generic, unique boot means that anyone, if they want to go for an ultimate build, they can run Flicker Step and get good value out of it. Now, there's a big question here because this is each enemy you evade through reduces your active cooldown by 2 to 4 seconds on your ultimate up to 10 seconds. So per evade, you can get 10 seconds. Now, the first question you're probably asking yourself is, why don't I just run? Like, can I get multiple evades? Like, can I get 3 or 4 evades total on this and just dash, 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 and that's 40 seconds off my ult and I'm good to go. So this one seems, at least from what we've seen on the dev streams that they've showed us, only drops with when you dash, you get movement speed increase, which means you're not going to have the reset. You're not going to be able to have multiple evades stacked up. Excuse me, it's attacks reduce evades cooldown. So it's not the movement speed, it's attacks reduce evades cooldown, which is the middle ground. It's kind of like the middle there. So you can actually get some pretty good resets with this. So this is what they showed us here: stats, movement speed, ultimate skill damage, and damage reduction from close enemies. And you can lower the cooldown of your ultimate as long as you hit 3 targets on a perfect roll for this. You can hit the maximum of 10 per, attack a bunch, reset, dash, attack a bunch, reset, dash. And you can actually get some nice resets on this. And there's some really cool synergies with other abilities and items that can go along with this. So it's not going to be max evade, but it is going to be attacks reduce evade cooldown, which makes this pretty dang good. Tybalt's Will is a generic unique pant. You deal 20 to 40% multiplicative increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. When you become unstoppable, gain 50 of your primary resource. This is going to work great for barbarians and druids that have tons of unstoppable in their build, like the Uber Bear build, the Unstoppable Bear build, any kind of those like pulverized builds with Bear, or even Barbarian that have the Shout build that has tons of unstoppable. You get crazy damage multiplier and you get your primary resource, which could be really, really good for those. And these are again in the pants slot. X-Fall's Corroded Signet. I'm so glad they added this in the list for season 2 because of the changes they're making to critical strike and to vulnerable damage. So in general, if you didn't know, the quick summary of this is they're taking all of the bonus crit damage and bonus vulnerable damage that you can get on items and in your Paragon, and they're making that all go into the additive bucket. So you get basically any amount of damage increase that you get from your gear or your Paragon is just going to be an additive total to scale things up. And then there's just a flat multiplier that goes on, 20% for vulnerable, 50% for critical strike, that gets applied at the end of the calculation. So it's all consistent. Everything is just about, 14% lightning damage is going to be better than 5% critical strike damage because the number is bigger and they're both additive at the end of the day. And then you want to kind of calculate that with how often you're critting and things like that. But there's a challenge here because in itself, dots can't crit, which means that if you're running with a crit build, those tend to fall behind because you can't have any kind of major scalars on top of that. So this is a nice way to balance that up, on top of the class changes they've made to some of the dot builds specifically for things like Necromancer that like to go around with that. So this is a lucky hit generic unique ring. Your damage over time effects have a 50% chance to erupt, dealing bonus damage of the same type to nearby enemies, which means that your dots have a chance to pulse an AoE of the same damage type when you do it, which means that you get a little bit more consistent damage procs, and it's not 1-to-1. I wonder how this is going to scale for damage scaling and base. They might end up changing this number here. This is pretty high if this is just the base value that they use to scale up the numbers, but it gives you a little bit more AoE, right? If you put a bleed, or if you put a shadow dot or a poison or something on an enemy, and that's pulsing AoE, you get some really good value out of that. And then you can spec maybe your dot build to be more single target, because it means that with this corroded signet, you can get more bonus damage in AoE, which helps you scale that build much, much better, which this is really good. I hope this ends up becoming meta for all of the dot builds in general. Soulbrand is a unique generic chest. Your healing potion no longer heals instantly. Instead, it grants a barrier for 200% of the healing amount for 4 seconds. While you have a barrier, you gain 20% damage reduction. So this is huge for barrier builds. There's a lot of builds in the game that are barrier focused, and you have things like lucky hit while you have a barrier up, cooldown reduction while you have a barrier up. While you have a barrier up, you deal more damage. And there's just so many different ways to rely on that, but there's only 1 or 2 classes that can really build barrier builds because they have so many barriers in their kit already, classes like Sorcerer. So with this Soulbrand unique chest, it means that those classes that don't have a lot of barriers can still build barrier, because potentially with this chest, if you have good healing from your healing potion, you get a big bonus of barrier, and while you have a barrier, you gain damage reduction, and you can combine that with other effects as well, which opens that door a little bit to more unique builds for the classes that don't normally run barrier. Next is the Banished Lord's Talisman, another unique generic that can just be applied to any class in the game, and this one fits into the amulet slot. After you spend 300 of your primary resource, your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower. So this is another way to guarantee an overpower, which is really cool. Your critical strikes that overpower deal increased damage, which is essentially giving overpower a way to critically strike. Overpower at its base does not critically strike. I know there's confusion around this. Every time I say overpower doesn't crit, there's always a handful of people that come out of the woodwork and say, no, but Drybear, when it's orange, that means it critically overpowered. And the answer is no. That just means that it happened to be a critical strike and an overpower at the same time. And so they just added it together into a single number, but the overpower damage is not being scaled by your critical strike multiplier. They are treated separately. And you can test this by getting a light blue number and an orange number and putting them side by side with the same build and stats. And you'll find that the orange number is only slightly higher than the light blue because it's only adding the critical strike scalar to the base value of your damage. However, with this change here, your critical strikes that overpower deal 120% increased damage. That means that when you do critical strike, effectively, your crit strike chance is critically striking that overpower, which makes overpower even more awesome. And this gives a nice scalar to overpower into end game builds. Not only are you getting free overpower guarantees through a separate source, every class in the game has the ability to do guaranteed overpowers like Bear Druid or Blood Necro, things like that. Being able to build that, like Hammer Barbarian, you can really easily get into those with guaranteed overpowers. But having another source means you can more consistently overpower, and your overpowers can now critically strike in essence, which means that this Banished Lord's Talisman is going to be super fun for making overpower strong in season 2. Now let's finish up on some new legendary aspects. A lot of these are going to be, there's like one for every class and then some generics as well, which helps kind of balance things out. But I think this also helps kind of finish that idea of theory crafting for season 2, so you know what's coming into the game. Aspect of Slaughter is a boot and amulet generic mobility aspect. I love the fact that they added this also to amulets. We have too many things that are stacked on boots, which means that you can get this as a legendary on your amulet, which means the value would go up by 50%, and you can free up more for boots. Maybe you can get crit movement speed, or you get movement speed after using an ability, things like that. And then you get another movement speed here for classes that are really slow, like Necromancer specifically. Aspect of Slaughter is a mobility aspect. You gain 20% movement speed in general. You lose this bonus for 2.5 seconds after taking damage, which means if you're playing at a distance or you're moving quickly and getting away from it, your base movement speed is higher, which means this can actually be really good for speed clearing or speed farming, or generally just helping builds that are slow but tanky or have high avoidance to be able to move quickly. I think this is really just going to be super awesome for slow Druid builds and for Necromancer builds, like minion builds that are generally just slower than every other class in the game. So having this as an option is going to be really, really cool. These aspects can be found on amulets, gloves, rings, and weapons, which is really, really nice. Keep in mind that along with this patch 1.2.0, they're also changing it so that a lot of the legendary powers that existed locked into a specific slot that didn't make sense, some of those have been freed up as well. So like hulking aspect, for example, is moved off of ring, so you don't have to have that locked into ring. So these are all amulet, gloves, rings, and weapons. Generic offensive aspect, which is going to be all of these are all offensive. Aspect of the elements is for every class in the game. Gain 20 to 30% additive, increased damage to a set of damage types for 7 seconds. This effect alternates between 2 sets. So this is your rotating a legendary power from Diablo 3, where it just rotates through. It'll rotate between fire, lightning, and physical, and then cold, poison, and shadow, which is all the damage types in the game that you can build, more or less. So you'll be able to kind of have that here. And you treat it the same way that you would treat the exact same copy of this effect that we would do in Diablo 3. In Diablo 3, I think it's actually 4 rotations instead of 2, which means it's going to be 25% of the time you have uptime on it. This is even better because it's 2 sets, which means that if say you're a full fire build, you just take these numbers and cut them in half, because then you have 50% uptime. For 7 seconds, you have your fire damage increased, and then for 7 seconds, you have no benefit, which means that take this, and instead of 30% additive damage, just think of it as like a global 15% additive damage, unless you're looking at specific burst windows where you need the damage up, but just over time, think of it as like a 50% multiplier on the value here. So 15% fire damage from a generic offensive aspect. You can put it in your offhand. If it's an offensive offhand, like a focus or a totem, you can do weapons, gloves, rings, amulets. This could be really, really cool to kind of help with those elemental builds. And keep in mind that everything's additive now, so the fact that this is an add of elemental damage is not as bad as it was before. Wanton Rupture aspect, Barbarian offensive. Your rupture does not remove the bleeding damage from enemies. This can occur once every 30 to 40 seconds. Now there's a question of when you do the final blow on Barbarian that does rip the blood off and remove it, and it gets an explosion from it. Does that also count there? Does that mean that you can rupture, add more bleeding, and then rupture again for big explosion? And having this go, it's actually pretty insane. It means that you get effectively over time, specifically for bosses, even more bleed damage. You can do the rupture detonation for how much bleed you have, and then you can keep adding more bleeding and stacking that up, and then rupture again. That gives you a lot of really cool options for that. And I think this is actually pretty cool for bleed builds, especially going along with the dot item that we have up here, which means that you can keep getting those bleeds to proc more damage AoE if you don't remove the bleed when you do your rupture. Raw Might is a Druid offensive aspect. After you hit 15 enemies with your Werebear skills, your next Werebear skill will deal 50% multiplicative more damage and stun enemies for 2 seconds. And this is twofold here. After you hit 15 enemies, so if you're doing Pulverize, by the way, you can very easily, or you're doing like Earth Bear and you're doing big AoEs, if you pulverize 15 enemies, this should count as 15 hits, which means this will immediately make your next Pulverize do 50% more damage. On top of that, it'll stun the enemies for 2 seconds. And on top of that, there's plenty of things, specifically in a Werebear build, where you get bonuses when you're hitting an enemy that is stunned. So having this CC on here is super nice. They'll hit diminishing returns pretty quickly, but it will allow you to kind of play around with that. And it helps you stagger bosses faster by getting more CC on that stagger bar. Pretty cool. Aspect of Artful Initiative, Rogue offensive aspect. When you spend 100 energy, which is going to be very easy to do, you release a cluster of exploding stun grenades that deal 0.3 total physical damage and stun enemies for half a second. Your grenade skills deal 15% X more damage. And by the way, Rogue Kit has tons of ways, like when you dash, you can spawn stun grenades, you can cause stun grenades to come out when you do CCs. There's all these crazy different combinations where you get multiple stun grenades. And for the longest time, I've been trying to do a grenade focused build with smoke grenade, stun grenade, physical grenade with rogue, and it's just never been that good. So I'm hoping that with more grenades coming out, plus more stuns, which might be able to scale off of it, and grenade skills going up, there might be some opportunities here for making that build come alive. So this is a pretty cool legendary that you can pick up. You might be able to put it on gloves or something, or maybe even put it on amulet if this scaling goes high enough and get some good damage off it. We'll have to see how that plays out. Aspect of the long shadow necromancer offensive aspect. This is a lucky hit. Your shadow damage over time effects have a 30% chance to generate 3 essence. Damage from your Shadow Blight key passive will always generate 2 essence. Now, what's great about this is there are, I think in like Infinite Mist and like Blood Mist and those builds, and even just the Shadow Blight burn builds are still going to be very strong and possibly even way better than anything ever was in season 1 comparatively, because there's nothing changing massively around dots. Everything that's like crazy in the game is coming down to where dots are, and dots were already doing very good for Necromancer in general. And keep in mind, we still have X-Falls Corroded Signet here. So being able to generate essence from this does open up some of the shadow builds for Necromancer to be able to include spenders. Like you might be able to just not have to worry about that and include spenders for core skills to get shadow damage out of that. That might be pretty cool. Maybe you can do Sever on top of your dot damage with the boots that give you a dot, shadow dot on top of everything else. And there might be some hybridizations that go into the dot build. So keep your eye on shadow builds for Necromancer this season. Lastly, we have Battle Caster's aspect. This is a sorcerer offensive aspect. Lucky hit, win your conjuration skills. So any of your summons hit, you have a up to 40% chance to gain +1 rank to your conjuration skills for 12 seconds. And this can stack up to 3 times. Now there's a question on if this snapshots or not, right? If you have your ice blades out or you have your lightning spear out and you generate a stack that probably doesn't retroactively apply to your summon, maybe it does. I'm not sure if they're 100% clear on this, at least in the base game or even just with this specific legendary in general. But if it does apply in retroactively and dynamically, this makes this really, really good. Now, keep in mind that as far as summons go, Sorcerer has some of the more time-limited summons, right? Like if you look at something like Lightning Spear, it doesn't last that long anyways. They're kind of, bouncing in and out, appearing, disappearing, that sort of thing. And so stacking that up should be pretty easy. There's also tons of ways to spawn Lightning Spear, get bonus ice blades, or even just spawning multiple Hydras could really get this value here up. And again, if this does apply retroactively, Hydra builds are looking really good because you get extra ranks on the Hydra that stacks up and up and up and up. And if it applies backwards to any active Hydra, even the special Hydra that you get from your enchantment or from your from the offensive amulet that you can get to get bonus, like a super multi-headed Hydra, all of those put together could actually get some really nice summoning builds coming out for Sorcerer. So if this actually does apply retroactively, I think we've got the books cooking for that one. And those are all the new legendaries and uniques going into the game. I tried to make it as quick as I could going through it, but here's what we've got coming in for season 2. I hope you guys are excited about it. If you found value in the video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and I'll see you on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.